to the exhibit!
Welcome to the history of mill in Hearthstone. I hope you enjoy the video. What is mill? Mill is a strategy revolving around forcing your opponent to draw cards. Usually so many cards that they cannot fit any more in their hand, and so they are forced to discard them. The ultimate win condition of the deck is either to burn the opponent's combo pieces so that the deck cannot perform its purpose, or to continue to force the opponent to draw cards once they are in fatigue, dealing massive damage in the process. Classic contained plenty of cards which enabled this sort of playstyle, with cards like Cold Light Oracle performing a key role in all mill decks from the moment that it was released. Rogue initially saw the most usage of the mill archetype because of cards like Shadow Step, Kidnapper, and Vanish, allowing you to return Cold Light Oracles to your hand. Kidnapper and Vanish also served the double purpose of putting cards back into your opponent's hand, alongside Sap. This meant that the opponent would be burning cards rather than drawing them, further impeding whatever their deck's game plan was. This game plan was augmented by other Rogue cards like Preparation, and meant that Rogue was the premier class for replaying multiple copies of the same card, which was key to the classic mill Rogue strategy. Key neutral cards like Youthful Brewmaster also enabled this game plan by allowing you to bounce Cold Light Oracles back into your hand. Even cards like King Muckler and Lawwalker Cho sometimes saw inclusion for big payoff turns, which filled the opponent's hand with stuff, preventing them from gaining access to their archetype's meaningful cards. Although a lot of the key cards for a promising mill archetype were there in Classic, the archetype was never particularly good in terms of competitive performance, but it was certainly an option that was open to Rogue players. Curse of Naxxrammas released Dancing Swords and Deathlord into the game, two cards with death rattles which forced your opponent to draw a card, or played an opponent's card from the deck, respectively. These cards saw some play in mill Rogue decks, but went mostly unutilized until further support was printed in Goblins vs Gnomes, allowing a new mill archetype to find meta relevance. Goblins vs Gnomes saw the spotlight shift from Rogue to Druid in terms of the most viable mill archetype. GVG gave Druids access to key cards which made a mill fatigue archetype viable, such as Grove Tender and Tree of Life, alongside the very strong neutral healing of Antique Healbot. These cards, alongside already existing cards like Naturalize and the previously mentioned Dancing Swords and Deathlord from Curse of Naxxrammas, allowed the mill archetype to find a home in Druid. The aim of the deck was to outlast your opponent through healing, while disrupting their game plan by burning key cards, eventually leading to an endgame where the opponent would hopefully be in fatigue before the Druid, allowing the Druid to once again force the opponent to draw fatigue cards for lethal. This archetype was reasonably popular, and was the first time that mill held a relatively large position as a meta-relevant deck. Blackrock Mountain once again shifted the focus for mill archetypes back to Rogue by printing an extremely powerful mill card in Gang Up. Gang Up served two purposes in mill Rogue. Firstly, it put more Cold Light Oracles into your deck, so that you could force your opponent to draw more cards in the long run. Secondly, the card shuffled the cards into your deck, putting you even further from fatigue relative to your opponent due to your deck containing 36 cards rather than 30 once you had played both Gang Ups. The addition of just this one key card alongside Rogue's already existing tools shot the deck up into a meta-relevant spot. With both Mill Druid and Mill Rogue being viable, this was probably the point in time where mill archetypes held the largest slice of the meta they ever would. The Grand Tournament would print cards to support both Mill Druid and Mill Rogue. Rogue got Beneath the Grounds, which gave the deck some additional board presence through the 4/4 Nerubians shuffled into the opponent's deck, which could be triggered relatively easily since the deck's objective was to make the opponent draw cards. Druid, on the other hand, received Mulch, which was certainly less powerful than Beneath the Grounds, but held a reasonable place in a mill archetype. The card was similar to a sap for Druid, but because of the random element of the card, it served as further disruption beyond what a normal sap would provide.
Who knows what secrets we'll uncover?
The League of Explorers gave both mill archetypes Bran Bronzebeard, a card which obviously had a very strong synergy with Coldlight Oracle as it doubled its battlecry. This made both archetypes far more explosive in terms of late game draw, allowing Bran double Coldlight on turn 9, which would draw 8 cards for both players, almost a third of both players' decks. This card was a very powerful role player in both mill archetypes for this reason, but from this point on we would begin to see Rogue favoured much more than Druid for mill archetypes. Perhaps the developers did not like the inevitability of the Druid archetype through the large amount of healing that it had access to. I'm not sure, but nevertheless Druid received no mill support beyond this, while Rogue continued to receive cards that supported the archetype. Whispers of the Old Gods marked the start of Standard as a game mode in Hearthstone, and heralded the removal of cards from Curse of Naxxrammas and Goblins vs Gnomes from this game mode. This was the end of Mill Druid in Standard, and there was never really any further support for Mill Druid printed further down the line in the game's life. The deck would continue to see some use in Wild after the implementation of Standard, but due to the aforementioned lack of support for the archetype in future expansions, the archetype would fade further and further into obscurity with each passing expansion. That is, unless you consider the Togwaggle Druid archetype, which later popped up in Wild, to be Mill, which we will discuss later in the video. Whispers of the Old Gods also printed another pseudo-bounce effect for Rogue in Shadowcaster, which had a battlecry that made a 1/1 copy of a minion which cost 1 mana. This effect is better than a bounce effect if targeting your own Coldlight Oracles, alongside an obvious synergy of making 2 copies alongside Bran. The card was slightly understated for the cost, but nevertheless found a strong niche in the Mill Rogue archetype. Mean Streets of Gadgetzan gave Rogue Gadgetzan Ferryman, a slightly more conditional version of Youthful Brewmaster. Despite this slight downside, having more bounce effects available to you for Mill is extremely important for fulfilling your game plan of playing as many Coldlight Oracles as possible, so the card saw plenty of play in the Mill archetype. At this point, Mill had held a reasonably strong presence in the meta since Blackrock Mountain, and as a result the novelty of the concept had worn off for many players. The deck was again a very divisive one, with many players loving to play it, but with many also feeling that having most of your cards deleted was not particularly fun. At this point in the game's life, the developers were trying to phase out mechanics that many players felt were frustrating, so Mill Rogue would soon find itself on the chopping block. Journey to Ongoro gave no new cards for the Mill Rogue archetype, but it did rotate the key cards of Gang Up, Beneath the Grounds and Bran to Wild, significantly reducing the power of the deck in Standard.
You're so sweet.
Knights of the Frozen Throne would give Mill Rogue Valera the Hollow, an extremely powerful card due to both its stealth effect and its new hero power, which made duplicating Coldlight Oracles far easier than it had been at any point so far in Hearthstone's history. This somewhat made up for the loss of Gang Up in the previous expansion, however this was a last hurrah for Mill Rogue really. The deck held a strong position in the Standard meta and was certainly playable, but by no means was it a tier 1 deck. Knights of the Frozen Throne would also push a new class into the Mill niche, Warlock. Warlock was given key Mill cards of Gnomeferatu, Howlfiend and Treachery. Gnomeferatu was just a good card. A 2-mana 2/3 was fine stat-wise, and the upside of removing a card from the opponent's deck could disrupt combos and give the Warlock an advantage should the matchup go to Fatigue. The card was just good, and saw play in many archetypes for that reason. The Howl Fiend Treachery combo was much more specialised, and only really saw play in decks which specifically sought to give the opponent Howl Fiend and then use Defile to cause the mass discarding of a lot of cards. The deck was an interesting combo, and always spectacularly amusing when pulled off, but it was never really a meta-relevant force in terms of power level. Nevertheless, this expansion had brought notable mill effects to Warlock, perhaps a sign of things to come.
We be taking this now. It's Kobold way.
Kobolds and Catacombs saw Faldorai's Strider printed for Rogue, giving it a slightly more powerful replacement for Beneath the Grounds, but it was not enough to significantly raise the status of the deck. Mill Rogue had received no supporting cards in Journey to Ungoro, and very few supporting cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne or Kobolds and Catacombs. With the release of the Witchwood in the following year and the start of the Year of the Dragon, Coldlight Oracle would be banished to the Hall of Fame, killing Mill Rogue in Standard. The deck remained a relevant and fun deck to play in Wild. It was never really meta-defining, but it was never unplayable either. The deck still occasionally pops up in Wild every now and again to this day. Other than Rogue, Kobolds and Catacombs was the expansion for deck destruction effects. Rin, the first Disciple, was printed for Warlock, which allowed for the destruction of the opponent's entire deck after a lengthy summoning process. Due to the sheer length of the summoning ritual, Azari would often only destroy between 8 and 15 cards, rather than 30. But this was still a very significant deck destruction effect, and allowed Warlock to really put slower opponents on the clock for the game. The effect isn't really mill as we knew it in the past, but as the game evolved, the definition of mill evolved also. And this was certainly a significant deck destruction effect, so I've chosen to include it here. In a similar vein, the neutral card King Togwaggle was also printed here. Not a mill card as such. It simply allowed you to swap decks with your opponent, while giving your opponent a 5-mana King's Ransom, which allowed them to swap back. It wouldn't see much play during Kobolds and Catacombs, but it would be a key combo piece for a mill-like archetype later down the line.
Your soul is in mine.
The Year of the Raven would roll around, and the Witchwood would bring with it a card called Azalina Soul Thief, which could replace your hand with a copy of your opponent's. Combining this with King Togwaggle allowed you to swap decks with your opponent and then copy their hand, meaning that when they swapped decks back with you, you could then swap back again, leaving them permanently stuck with your deck. The combination of these cards together cost 15 mana, however, so how could you play Azalina before your opponent swapped the decks back? Well, Kobolds and Catacombs had printed a card called Twig of the World Tree for Druid. This weapon restored you to 10 mana crystals when broken, so the combo was thus. Equip Twig of the World Tree and wear it down to 1 durability. Get Togwaggle and Azalina in your hand. Play Togwaggle, swapping decks with your opponent. Break the Twig to regain 10 mana. Play Azalina to copy your opponent's hand. When the opponent uses King's Ransom to swap decks back, use your King's Ransom to swap again on the following turn, leaving the opponent stuck with your deck. If this sounds incredibly unreliable, then that's because it was. The deck was ridiculously inconsistent in Standard because of the Twig of the World Tree. All it took was some weapon destruction effect, and the Druid had lost the game. In Wild, however, the deck was much more consistent. This is because, instead of Twig of the World Tree, you could run Aviana and Kuhn the Forgotten King. Aviana cost 9 mana at the time, which meant that you could play Aviana for 9, followed by Kuhn for 1, which refilled you to 10 mana. Then you could play both King Togwaggle and Azalina for 1 mana each to pull off the combo. How did this deck even win the game, you may ask? Other than Aviana, Kuhn, King Togwaggle and Azalina, the deck would be filled entirely with removal and draw cards. So you would draw your entire deck very quickly to get to the key combo pieces, then give your almost empty deck of bad cards to your opponent, who could then do nothing for the rest of the game but wait for fatigue to kick in. This combo was still relatively inconsistent, as you had to draw 4 separate pieces to pull it off. Cards like Hemet the Jungle Hunter would help you to only draw these high-cost combo pieces, but an even better card for the deck was printed in the next expansion, the Boomsday Project. Juicy Psych Melon was a phenomenal card for this archetype, as it drew all 4 of your combo pieces for only 4 mana, since they happened to be costed at 7, 8, 9 and 10 mana respectively. This card pushed Togwaggle Druid over the edge into an oppressive deck in Wild, as the combo became ridiculously consistent to pull off at 10 mana, and Druid could rush to 10 mana before the other classes due to their ramp cards, like Biology Project, Jade Blossom and Wild Growth. This was the new dominant mill archetype in Wild. Rather than forcing your opponent to draw too many cards, you would instead draw all of your cards yourself and then give your opponent either an empty or at the very least useless deck. This archetype was meta-defining during the Boomsday Project Wild meta, with only hyper-optimized aggressive decks like Secret Mage and Odd Paladin really standing a chance against it. This could not last, however, as the deck saw one of the quickest Wild exclusive changes to ever take place. Only 2.5 months after the release of the Boomsday Project, Aviana was nerfed to 10 mana, killing the consistent method of pulling off this combo. The deck would still exist in Wild, but it would have to rely on Twig of the World Tree like the standard version, and it was much less consistent as a result. The deck mostly died off after this change, but it still pops up now and again with Twig of the World Tree, even up to today. After this debacle, Mill lost a lot of popularity in both Wild and Standard, and pretty much no Mill support of any kind was printed until Madness at the Darkmoon Faire, a full 2.5 years after the Boomsday Project. Madness at the Darkmoon Faire marked Hearthstone's first new mill-like effect in a very long time, in the form of Ticketus. Ticketus destroyed 5 cards from your deck, or 5 from your opponent's deck if it was corrupted, which required a card of higher cost to first be played while Ticketus was in hand. Ticketus was pretty divisive. It was certainly fun to play and see your opponent's key cards being burned away, but for the opponent it was a much less fun experience. No one ever likes having their deck destroyed, after all. On top of this, Yasharaj the Defiler also allowed Ticketus to be played twice per game, for a total of 10 cards burned, which was a whole third of the opponent's deck, requiring only a 2-card investment. The card has not been changed as of the making of this video, but I would not be surprised to see it changed at some point in the future. Nevertheless, Ticketus brought Mill back to Warlock as a theme, and it seemed like Blizzard would lean even more into this in the following expansion. In a poetic twist of fate, Forged in the Barrens introduced a strange combination of cards, which seemed to encourage the Warlock to mill their own deck. Cards like Bloodshard Bristleback, Barrens Scavenger and Neru Fireblade encouraged the Warlock to burn through their own deck very quickly, while cards like Altar of Fire and Soulrend enable the Warlock to burn their own cards in the case of Soulrend and both players' cards in the case of Altar of Fire. The cards have seen plenty of experimentation in the first few days of the expansion, but with very limited success. Will these cards pay off in the long run? I suspect not. The upside isn't large enough to make the Warlock actually want to discard a lot of their own cards and put themselves in fatigue. I do have hope, however, that the payoff cards will still see play in a normal control Warlock deck, with Ticketus as the only mill card. Possibly Altar of Fire could see some use if you really want to lean into the mill angle and the meta is very combo heavy. This is where the history ends for mill in Hearthstone so far. From a deck enabled by only one key card, which focused on discarding your opponent's cards, to a deck which focuses primarily on discarding your own cards, whether to later give that deck to your opponent, or to trigger some kind of payoff in your own hand. With Blizzard seemingly showing a renewed interest in card destruction as a mechanic in their two most recent expansions, I'm interested to see where the archetype goes next. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please consider leaving a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, it would really mean a lot to me. Let me know in the comments what you think Blizzard will do with the mill archetype in the future. I'm really curious to see what your guys' perspectives are on where they're taking the whole archetype. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.